Last week, we talked about how to build a sustainable career. Today, I want to start with a new question. It's, are we trying to earn a living with our head, or are we trying to earn one with our hands? Last week, we would kind of think our job is something we do with our hands. Today, we're gonna make a little bit of an argument that the way we use our noodles here, Mark, might be the most important thing. Welcome to the Lead Everyday Show. I'm Randy Gravitt.
And I'm Mark Miller.
And Mark, you have pushed me so hard through the years to think. I mean, I love just that simple word of let's think, and let's make sure that we're putting some time on our calendar. And it is amazing, man. I keep talking to people over and over about this concept, and they look at me sometimes like, I don't have any time for that. I don't have time to think. And I heard you say a while back, it's actually, that is your job as a leader, especially the higher up you go in an organization. I know we've talked about this before a little bit under the banner of margin, but today I want us to go a little deeper and a little more tactical maybe than we've ever been here. And I know there are a lot of leaders out there who are going to benefit from this conversation. So thanks for pushing me on this. I think you've worked on this yourself. I know I'm working on it. I think every leader, this is an area of their life where they do need to continue to push themselves to be the brains, so to speak. And we want smart people around us, but as leaders, it is imperative that we think as well along the way. So we're going to talk about that today.
Yeah. And it's something that, as you referenced, that I'm working on, you're working on. I don't think you can ever stop working on this topic. I think there's a gravitational pull towards a couple of things. One is activity and busyness. I think there's something in our psyche that makes us feel like doing email for 6 hours has really been a great day. I mean, yeah, somebody's got to do your email, but it may not have added anything to the bottom line. It may have not have added anything to the top line. It may not have even added any value. See, I think that's part of the discernment that's required. There's this pull towards activity, and in our minds, we can assume that activity is accomplishment. And so I think we've got to be really, really careful there. The other gravitational pull that we have to fight is to work with our hands. And that is a noble way to make a living. And there are hundreds of millions of people around the world that make their hands with their living, make their living with their hands.
Make their living with their hands, yeah.
There are hundreds of millions of people that make their living with their hands, and that's great. That is not the primary way that leaders earn the differential that they're paid. They need to think. They have to think. They must think, but we get pulled towards, let me do it. Let me engage with my hands. And I've talked to those leaders, just like you referenced a moment ago. When you talk to them about their time to think, they'll literally look you in the eye and say, I don't have time for that. And my typical response is, who's doing the thinking? Right. And to your point, we want everybody to think, but who's thinking about the future? Who's thinking strategically? Those typically aren't the frontline people. They're thinking, but they're thinking about how to execute. They're thinking how to deliver on the promises that the organization has made. And that's good thinking. But we need leaders to think at another level. They've got to think further out. They've got to think more about implications and consequences and competition and resource allocation and scarcity, complexity. You've got to figure out, what are your biggest problems? We could make a list. We could spend this whole episode making a list of the things leaders need to think about, which is why it just breaks my heart and scares me to death when we find so many leaders that say they don't have time to think. It's like, I mean, we're knowledge workers, leaders. Peter Drucker coined that phrase years and years ago. We make our living predominantly by solving problems, by preventing problems, by thinking about some of those things that I just mentioned a moment ago. We are paid for our judgment and our intuition. Well, where is judgment and intuition formed? It's in the time when we have allocated to thinking. So I'm the older I get, the more I appreciate those are the leaders that make the greatest difference in the world. The ones that are not blindly caught in an activity trap, but they're thoughtful, they're purposeful, they're strategic. And all of that is born out of time to think.
Well, you mentioned a couple things there with activity and busyness, but I think another one that is maybe needs to be layered in. Let's remind people that distraction is at an all-time high as well, and so it's just there's a war going on against this what we're talking about today. So we're trying to take back some of the turf today and make sure that we're doing the things that we need to set our organizations, our teams up for success. Because if we don't do this, like you said, who's going to do it? You can't delegate your thinking. I mean, it's just not.
Yeah. And so the very first step that we've talked about and we've written about and we continue to talk about, it's really, really, really simple in concept, even though it can be challenging to execute. And that is to put time on your calendar dedicated for thinking. And you call it what you will, but there is time, a chunk of time. We'll talk in a minute about how much time, but there is designated time to think. And so I think that is my first question for you guys that are watching this and listening to it is, do you have designated time on your calendar to think? That's step one.
When you start asking that question, Mark, in a room, I've asked this question for the last 6 months or so. I've been reminding leaders that noise makes it onto your schedule, whether you schedule it or not. All that activity and distraction and busyness, it's like it just fills the calendar up if we're not careful. But time to think won't make it onto your schedule unless you schedule it, to your point. So that is, to me, if they don't get anything else out of today's episode, it's like I've got to have time on my schedule to think, and I'm going to need to protect that time. I know you've said before, like when you put that meeting on the calendar, it's imperative that if somebody calls and says, I need to meet, I've done this before. Like I've got this think time scheduled and somebody calls and I'm like, okay, I'll just give them that time because that feels like it's extra. No, that is the primary work at that point. And that needs to be protected at all costs, if you ask me.
So
the longer I go, the more I believe that.
Yeah, you just tell those people, I'm sorry, I've already got a meeting scheduled. And you look for another time. Now, if their meeting is pressing or urgent or it's your boss and you've actually got to do it, well, then my strategy is you look for another place to replace the time that you just gave away some or part of it, because it's actually non-negotiable. Now, I want to say one more thing about this time, and then we're going to spend the balance of this session today talking about what do you do with the time, because that's the question that I think you and I get most often. Even though people think this idea is weird, if you can encourage people just to try it on faith, just as an experiment, many people will actually schedule it. And then they say, oh, I don't know what to do during that time. So we're going to get to that. But one more thing about scheduling time, and I've gotten this question so much: how much time do I need to schedule? I have no idea. Let me give you a couple of, data points and encouragement. Here's the data point. Harvard, not long ago, finished a 12-year study looking at the calendars of CEOs. Now, you're saying, well, you're not a CEO. Okay, I'm not a CEO. But here's the deal. I've known a lot of CEOs over the years, and I know it's a very demanding role. Whether you're the CEO of $1 million business or a $1 billion business, it's a demanding role. Yet, Harvard discovered, after looking at the day-to-day calendars of these CEOs for 12 years, that in a typical work week, those men and women invest 28% of their time alone. Now, so you're thinking, well, is that the magic number? I have no idea. It's not 20 minutes a week. It's not 30 minutes a week for me and you. If a CEO thinks they need 28% of their time alone, thinking, doing the things we're going to talk about in this session, I think that should give us some confidence that we may need more time than we think. The other thing I would say to you is, the bigger your hopes, the bigger your dreams, the bigger the challenges, the bigger the obstacles, the more time you're going to need to think.
Yeah.
And so to get into this game, I'm going to say start with an hour, 1 hour, put it on your calendar. Is that the right amount? Probably not. I doubt you'll need less. You may need more. Start with 1 hour.
I think the point, Mark, is if you've got some kind of big challenge that you're facing, you're probably not going to solve it in the shower or riding on the way to work, right? You got to have some dedicated time that you're going to really work to think through this. And I just think it's so underutilized for most leaders. When again, we're having, and I'm not just, that's not theory. That's like, I'm having conversations with real leaders who are just saying, I don't have enough of that time. And you said years ago, I heard you, I remember one time you said, the higher up you go in an organization, the more time you're probably going to need to spend alone. And what do you do when you're alone? You think. And we're going to give some specifics here, but I just believe that is the best leaders really do have a plan, a strategy. They've assessed things. All that kind of stuff. It happens there. And they're much more effective as a result, which is what they're paid to do.
Yeah. So let's unpack it, because again, we've gotten this question so much, and hats off to the men and women that were bold enough to put the time on their calendar, and then they call and go, or send me a text and go, okay, I've got this hour, I've got this 2 hours, I've got a half a day. What do I think we'll just walk you through a simple framework and give you some prompts. This is not definitive nor exhaustive, but it's all under the banner of think. So I'll kick it off, Randy, and you just jump in wherever you want to jump in. But I would suggest that you start with picking a topic, a single topic, and it can be a problem, an opportunity, a past event that you want to critique and review and learn from it. It could be about the future, but you pick something about how we respond to competitors. It may be, if you are familiar with our work where we first published this, it was in a book called Smart Leadership. And we introduced this concept. Randy mentioned it earlier. We called it margin, but it's really about thinking. And the premise of that book is what is holding a lot of leaders back is the quicksand, the busyness and distractions and complexity and fear and fatigue, success, whatever your toxic mix is, those things that are impeding your success. If you're in quicksand, that might be your single topic for this dedicated time. So start by picking something.
You mentioned, Mark, I don't know if it was last week or the week before, we were talking about experience, and you talked about experience is not the important thing. It's evaluated experience. I think that ties in here. It's this, do we have time to pick our topic and to reflect on what's really happening? Why is this an issue? If it is an issue, or what is this opportunity? I mean, just that time to reflect. It's really kind of where it starts. And I've had conversation with so many leaders who they have the hour scheduled, and then they'll get in there and they find themselves, again, go back to the distraction. I found myself, my email dinged, or I think the environment matters. I think finding a quiet place, knowing it's dedicated time, I'm going to set aside where I'm distraction free. Maybe I don't even have devices with me. I just got to, I had a leader tell me one time, just get a legal pad and a pen and a window is all you need. What's the window for? Look out the window. Just look out the window, and it'll cause you to, begin to think. And you've got a place just to reflect and to write down. And we could probably come up with some questions I could reflect on. But I think it's powerful to start with, like, where am I? Like, what's going on here? It's just so, it grounds me. It grounds me in reality, back to your smart leadership mindset.
Yeah. Yeah. So that first step is to reflect. And I think, to your point, the reflection questions that you ask will have something to do with what you've chosen to focus on. But how did we get here? What were the contributing factors that led us to this opportunity or this problem? Or if it's the evaluated experience, you had your annual meeting last week, you spent a lot of time, you brought a lot of people in. Let's reflect. What worked well? What didn't work well? What did we learn? What were the impediments to the objectives that we, predetermined. And in any of these scenarios, I think you need to look in the mirror and say, what have I learned? What have I contributed to this problem or to this opportunity? What might I have done differently? So I think the questions to me are the really the on-ramp to this entire session.
Yeah.
Step one
that's good.
is to reflect.
To reflect. I ask myself sometimes, where am I in the way on this? I mean, I've this mindset, if I'm not careful, I'll be the bottleneck to what's going on. As the leader, oftentimes we have our hands in more stuff than we should. And that's why we don't have time to think, because we're doing I always say it's not your job to do everybody else's job. And yet sometimes my comfort level is to, let me just help with that, or it's easier for me to go ahead and do it. And the next thing you know, I've robbed myself of all that time for margin, and that reflecting. One of the things I might need to reflect on is, like, what am I doing to enable this, to cause this, to, prevent this from getting better? Just so many great questions we can ask as we start reflecting on what really is the reality. We've got to start where we are. Thankfully, we don't have to stay there. But I think reflecting is a first place to start. Okay, so let's move to what I sometimes feel like is reflection's cousin, and then we assess. I mean, I think they're different. Talk to us about the differences there, but let's reflect and then let's assess.
Yeah, like I said, the framework is not definitive nor exhaustive, but if you need some handles, reflect is about looking back. Assess is about looking at reality today. I mean, not that the past is not real, but I'm saying, what are the implications for today? Like, what's it going to take to solve this? What's it going to cost? How much are we investing today to address this problem? Because you're going to learn some things, right? This whole thinking process is a learning process. And so what are the implications? What do you believe the root causes are if you're trying to solve a problem? What happens if we play it forward in your mind? You're not in the final stages yet, but what happens if we don't address this? What happens if we get this right as the best you can discern today? So reflect is about the past. Assessing is about the implications for today. And then you can move to the third and final stage, which is to create. This is totally future focused. In light of what we've learned, in light of the current situation, the current reality, the current implications, what do we need to do differently?
Would you go so far as to
say, number
Mark,
of questions you can unpack there?
Yeah, that's great. Would you go so far as to say this one is a little bit? I mean, I link this to vision. I mean, this is like what, and I know vision, we can talk about it in a lot of different ways, but I think just the simplicity of saying what's going to be different based on the way I'm thinking here, and what do I need to do to rally the troops here toward this. But I like questions like, what do I want to be true a year from today that's not true today, and then stretch it out. Like, what do we want to be true in a decade? Again, this might be one of those times that I'm doing some disruption with myself. If you missed the episode on disruption a couple of weeks ago, you may want to go check that out. We talked about disruption for 2 weeks ago, I believe it was. But I like this like, what is going to change here? We're gonna it's the old better is going to require us to do something different, and it's just not going to be enough for us to think about it. Like, we're going to have to implement some change here, right? We're going to take some action.
Yeah, but I don't want to gloss over where you started. If you're going to create, which is what this phase of this time is dedicated to, I think creation at some level always touches on vision, because you're trying to create or build or orchestrate a preferred future, but it doesn't stop with vision, because that's when you move into the other things you just mentioned, the very tactical, the very pragmatic. I mean, it might not be tactical, but maybe it's strategic. Maybe it's we need to do X, Y, Z to address this problem. Or maybe we don't even know, but we know we've got to address this problem. So one of the pragmatic things is, I'm going to appoint a leader. I'm going to put somebody on this. We're going to build a team. So you may not get all the answers here, but you put the pieces in place so that you can ultimately get the answers, right? What budget do we need to allocate? What can we learn from others that we can apply in this situation? What is my role going forward in creating this system, this process, this new approach, this new methodology? So it starts with that vision of what you're trying to resolve, what you're trying to create, what you're trying to produce. But I think it needs to move very quickly into, as you said, what actions are going to be taken by you and potentially by others.
I like this, even going back as simple as like what needs to happen in the next week. And maybe a question I ask myself is, who do I need to meet with by Thursday, kind of thing. It's like, who am I going to meet with first? When do I need to tell my team do we need to have a meeting for some decisions that need to be made together? But I like that very tactical side of it. And then another thing I'd say, Mark, I want to kind of shift gears here. I like in the create phase saying, what barriers or obstacles do we anticipate? That's a great question to ask yourself when you're thinking, because I think sometimes we complain when those things pop up. They oftentimes could have already been dealt with in my own mind before they even popped up. I could make some assumptions, right?
And
I like
some of that. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, years ago, I again, I'm making some reference, some of the things you've taught me through the years, but I remember one time you were going into a meeting with somebody and you had this list of questions, and I'm like, it was a long looking list. And I'm like, what do you tell me about the questions? And you said, a lot of times if I'm going to meet with my supervisor and I'm going to present something, a project or whatever that I've created in my, in my plan, I'll list out 50 questions that I think they might ask me before the meeting. And you said, rarely have I ever been in a meeting over the last however many decades you've been doing this, where they've asked me something that I hadn't already thought they might ask me this. Well, that to me is another example of what you do in your thinking time. It's a little bit of a side road here, but there are a lot of people listening who aren't the CEO. They're not the owner. They're just in a role somewhere, and they can be thinking as well. So I don't think this is like, you have to be the CEO, to spend 28% of your time thinking. I think all of us need to be thinking at these kind of levels. And I just remember when you shared that with me, I'm like, that's a guy who's really given some thought to what he's trying to do and how he's trying to add value. You can elaborate on that or go somewhere else, but that to me is an example.
I think that's a great example. You have to have time to do that type of work, and you're probably not going to do that well or thoroughly in the shower or driving to and from the office, if you even go to the office. What worries me is how many leaders used to do their thinking in their commute and they don't have a commute anymore. So my intuition is the level and quantity of thinking has actually gone down since people don't go to the office because they've lost that think time. Even though it was insufficient, it was better than nothing. And so that's kind of a sidebar as well. But I think part of what you're thinking about is not just how you solve problems, but how you prevent problems.
Mm-hmm.
I know some senior leaders that think they're about solving problems, and I've literally challenged some of them about, well, what would happen if you invested time proactively to prevent those problems, to anticipate them, and to take the steps so they never materialized? But that requires
that's good
thinking.
One more, I'll give one more create question here. I like the question at the end of that, when you start thinking about where you're going to go, like out of your meeting, how are we going to measure progress? That to me feels like an important question as well. Let's don't lose that one.
It is. And let me say, as with several of these, you may not actually get the answer, but because you've thought about it, when you commission the leader or commission the team or begin to take next steps, you may walk into that conversation with, hey, here are 4 or 5 things I've already thought about. I don't know the answers to, but let's include that in this project scope as we move forward.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so
let me say one more thing, because I know we're winding down here. I don't think you're going to have any shortage of things to think about if you try this experiment of having some dedicated time. But just to hedge your bet, I would encourage you to begin making notes of things that you would like to think more deeply about at some point in the future. And then when that opportunity comes, whether it's an hour next week or 2 hours the week after, you can go to your list and say, which of these topics do I believe would have the greatest return or the greatest impact? And that's where you start. It may be the 5th thing you wrote on your list or the 10th thing you wrote on your list. And how long do you work on that? Well, until it's resolved. And it may take multiple of these thinking sessions. Then you can go back to your list, which is a running evergreen list, and go through the exercise again and say, today I'm going to work on number 7. And you just go through the drill again. Reflect,
Yeah, that's great.
assess, and create.
Well, and I think people get the spirit of what we're talking about here. It's like, what have we learned from our past? What's our current reality? And then where do we want to go in the future? And I think that reflect, assess, and create is a great way to do it. I will say this kind of as the takeaway, just a couple of other possibilities. You and I know a guy who actually does a think week every year, or he's got a think list, like you said, he keeps, and he'll go and take some time during the summer and think about those things deeply. I think that is much more radical sounding to a lot of people. And just, can I put an hour on my calendar? Let's start with a baby step. But I like the list, Mark, and I would encourage everybody here. I hadn't really thought about this until right now. Maybe we need a think book. We need a think notebook that's different than all the other books, but it's something that we can keep coming back to week after week after week when we have these hours, hopefully plural, scheduled to do some deep thinking. It's amazing what could happen if we do that versus we just sort of fly by the seat of our pants in a thoughtless way, and we end up not doing our very best work, and effectiveness and legacy and all kind of stuff suffers. So
let's go back to where I started. There's this gravitational pull. We can think that activity is accomplishment. And most of the time, if it's mindless, non-strategic, and random activities, it's not the same as accomplishment.
Yeah, that's great. That's so great. All right. So our homework for you this week is to think. Go spend some time thinking.
Schedule 1 hour.
1 hour. Put it on your
schedule.
calendar.
1 hour.
Schedule an hour. Noise is going to make it on your schedule, but thinking will not unless you schedule it. So let's make sure we protect that this week, and I believe it'll help us be more effective in what we're trying to do. We're trying to encourage you to think at a higher level. One of the things you can do to help us is to share with your coworkers, your fellow leaders, your friends, family, whoever you know that could benefit from this. We hope you'll help us continue to grow the Lead Every Day audience here. Remember, the best leaders really do lead every day.